I have a bit of a low voice because I have a cold, which will lend me more authority than I should have. We'll be going together through some of the, well, I would say with slightly pretentiously theoretical issues that I developed or noticed in the past years. And I never did so until I turned 49, because somehow I always thought an artist shouldn't speak too much. And but at one point you're confronted with the things that really occupy your mind, and you have to speak out at one point. So I brought with me essentially four issues, and the first one being dark optics. And the story of dark optics is all about a period which lies ahead of us, which is in transition as we speak, which is the life of images after the camera. So after digital and after the digital camera. So when we do not actually use lens technology to produce cameras, to produce images, sorry. And that, I hope I will make you understand that there's a strange reintroduction of the word. And if we speak about the word, we speak about written history, linear writing, and therefore we speak about old powers that apparently faded with the invention of photography. And now that the history of photography lies behind us, we perhaps could think about what it means when the camera photography and the moving image keep on having an afterlife in which they've actually been devoured or consumed and digested by algorithms. Then the second topic, which is marked in grey, is another object which I discerned a few years ago, was that I was very much occupied with digital materiality. But unlike the exhibition that is on view right now at the Eye, my search for digital materiality really lies always in relation to that obvious camera image, or the similarity to the camera image, as if it has taken on an old shape, something that's been eclipsed, while actually making it appear as if it's as fit as ever. And digital materiality is the story of those aspects of our concrete biological lives that have been affected by everything that's digital. And it is the rhythm, it's of course time, linearity of time, which no longer is needed the way clock time was needed during early modernity. But it goes quite a bit further than that, and I have a few examples with me. For example, the oil workers piece, which is about a state between water and oil, or even the quiet shore, which is a state between something that has crystallized and something that looks like water. So in my approach, really digital materiality always is translated back to something very photographic. However, anything virtual, anything digital will always exist only in a suspension between two states. It will never really materialize into an object. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect on how we perceive objects. The third is, I will try not to speak about it, but it's something I'm very fond on, is radical incorporation, or I've dubbed this pre-corporation, which is something that I believe it's an English writer by the name of Mark Fisher brought me to when he spoke about the life of Kurt Cobain, and how Kurt Cobain was very much aware that it didn't matter what he did, or however much rage he would, and however much opposition he would perform to MTV, etc., it was all programmed from the start. So it's a form of, it goes back to Jean Baudrillard, you could say, with the difference that cyber culture of the 90s didn't really consider physicality. Cyberculture was considered to be an event without physicality, and we know better by now that physicality is, of course, very much there. And the fourth, on which I would like to speak a little bit more, would be something I found out really just recently in a conversation that I had with the philosopher, Italian philosopher Emanuele Coccia at the Centre Pompidou last April on anti-anthropocentrism. And I was never aware that even throughout my career, starting with works like the Bordeaux Peace from 2004, up until Olympia, which is a 1,000-year-long virtual film, I was really concerned with the moving image, but not so much with the actor, and not so much with the foreground, but with all those processes which are unimportant to the camera eye. And the camera eye somehow is a very strange phenomenon in the sense that it's a hunter's eye. We chase and we shoot images. And we have a certain virtuosity in doing so. While I realized, and only recently, that my attention really was towards those objects which were dwarfed by the foreground, processes like time, the passage of time, if there's something like real time, can we observe it in the moving image? And what is the violence inherent in the filmic image? This 25 frames per second or 24 frames per second, or even the much faster rate. What is that violence, and how does it relate to your corporeal reality, which in fact can never grasp that movement? And from there I realized that in fact I had a certain romantic longing for processes which usually are cast out of the foreground, which would be the movement of the sun in real time, or the growth of vegetation in real time, which is a process which is necessarily too slow for the human being to observe, because it needs to happen in real time. And real time is simply that which you do while you breathe, and it's really the only capital to which you can fall back over and over again, while clock time is in fact financial capital. It's that kind of share or market share of which you lose permanently more. So I've made a little sketch yesterday on what I believe, I mean, these are all inventions, so you could consider they're illusions made up by an artist, but I'm just trying to think out loud where to position the history of photography. And that includes, of course, the history of the moving image. Shall we just say the analog image, the image that where light leaves a trace onto a chemical substance and then is fixated and then being reperformed in time through a device. And one could say we're speaking about roughly 160 years, where let's say that we start with Niepce's development of from lithography and then actually managing to fixate evaporating traces of light onto a surface. Shall we just take 1839 as a beginning? The 1840s are more generally very fascinating key moment in time. There's a lot that turns around that date somehow, including Industrial Revolution and so on. I set the beginning or the awareness by artists somewhere again, one could say arbitrarily, in 1798 with Los Caprichos by Goya. And Goya is considered to be, later on then of course in the black paintings, is considered to be the genesis of modern painting. And of course, many of us are aware that photography is not really invented in 1839, but the awareness among artists that the dominant pictorial system of painting disintegrates is, of course, much older than that. We could say, again arbitrarily, roughly 200 years before the invention of photography, or maybe with the onset of the scientific revolution. You can just pick a date there. And then I've set the end of photography as a system of checks and balances in 2001. Also, this date is up for debate, but somehow September 11, 2001 is a key date that's in all of our heads collectively as a moment where something rather strange happens, and after which a lot of the old order somehow starts to change again or transform again into something unknown. And then, strangely enough, from 2001 we go back to 1839. And with that, I lightly, provocatively refer to a return to the 19th century. Not only culturally, but also economically, politically, socially. I detect a return to the 19th century on many levels, and that includes a return to serfdom, feudalism, pay rent, but also, and this is more notably what I would like to talk to you today, the changes in photography and the changes in the camera image, which return slowly to a state which is closer to the tableau. Did I forget anything? No, I don't think so. So, this term of dark optics is really could be replaced by many other titles. But maybe we should just repeat a bit of first day of photography history in academy. Analog images were thought to provide mutual authentication between what is in front of the lens and who's behind the camera. It subcontracted a recently lost truth system, namely God, to a device and the technology that developed out of it. Underneath, I've just added today that the liberal origin of the camera is in fact the secular immaculate conception. So what you have as a camera, sorry for that one, as an early device is that you have in fact something that is ready for anything. Really pretty much a liberal position. It does somehow signal that it doesn't have a political agenda, it doesn't have a pictorial agenda neither, all you need is sunlight. And then we will come back to sunlight as something that's actually part of the past. The sunlight itself, and this is why I gave the title for my speech to dark, or dark optics. The sunlight somehow was a systematic returning aspect in the camera. Therefore, the camera as a device is a device of hope. And in my first page, I wrote that the camera was a system of checks and balances. And if you think about for a moment what that means, checks and balances mean to be able to reorient yourself amidst industrial revolution, amidst all this chaos. And can you just imagine for a moment what it must have been to live in Paris or London in the heydays of smog, where you had, on one hand, you had impressionists painting a system of light which was too brilliant for the eye, in fact, while the daily reality on the street was that the smog was everywhere. And you couldn't, it cut to your throat and you couldn't actually breathe properly. So you had these paradoxes in during early modernity and mid-modernity. Now, this system of authentication that photography provided is lost. And it's my belief that it generated an anxiety, let's say just a lot of questions in how to relate to images, how to relate to the photographic, or shall I just say to the automatic images. And automatic images are images where you don't have a creator, or at least collectively you do not really see a creator. You think it's actually a device that recorded it. But little by little we start to collectively understand that this device really only was a pretext, that it was a system of confidence and truth, and that when the system of confidence and truth is lost, there are a few problems on the horizon. The analog era is now closed and lasted roughly 100 years. It transitioned briefly into the digital camera, which still used lenses, and which in fact tricked a lot of people in thinking that the dichotomy between digital and analog was one of the vérité of the analog image with the manipulative aspect of digital images, digital images. But that was an illusion too. We're moving into an era where images are no longer dependent on light, but born out of the three C's: concept, conversation, and consensus. Example given: long deliberations on vegetation used in an image. In my case, that would be the Olympia piece that I had made recently. And they would require a degree in biology in order to be able to solve them adequately, but they're settled using Google or Wikipedia. So in fact, we do not have time to go through the degree of biology in order to define what images or what vegetation in dark optics would be. So we settle for a reduction, for a limited version, something that is not too complicated. And we agree on an image or on a situation out of that. People who are very deep into gaming culture or into pictorial 3D will understand what I'm talking about. And I realized that concept, conversation, and consensus were going to be what images are all about. Because of an experience that I had some 6-7 years ago when I wanted to make a piece which was entirely filmed in a forest. But I would do so using only 3D images. And now, technically, this evolution, of course, goes very rapidly. But I realized that there was really a radical departure from the camera there, in the sense that the dreaded Cartesian space, or let's say just Euclidean space with the 3 coordinate axis on which any object is situated, does a strange re-entry in dark optics. And that's a fundamental difference with the camera. The camera is ready for anything. You just need a place, you need a light condition, you need to be somehow together with this object of interest. And you have a system of authentication. When you're in Cartesian space, which is really something that to whom many artists are profoundly allergic to, you actually define any object, every object, whether it's a pixel or anything. But that object in Cartesian space wants to be seen as an object which is entirely liberal, it's entirely free of movement, which it is structurally not. It is structurally only possible to be there when it is defined through the 3 axes. So I realized when I was working on travel that even anything organic would require a lot of concept, conversation, and consensus. And this consensus brought me to thinking that actually what we were talking about in new photography, we were really talking about a reduction in the possibilities. While what digital does, it actually seems to promise an opening up ad infinitum. So dark optics actually are married to Cartesian space. So Cartesian space, let's just recapitulate for a moment. We have a cube, we have a fixed position of a viewer, we have an object in space which is perfectly determined, and then we have, in the horizon, we have an ad finitum. We have an endless point. So essentially, in dark optics, the infinite view is reintroduced, and that's the difference with analog image making. I just show a quick example, I will come back to this, on how all these aspects come together in the pieces that I've made in the past. This is a still that is taken from a computer program, which runs in real time, and which, as a piece of software, hopefully will last 1,000 years. It is based upon the Olympic Stadium in Berlin. And of course, it's an irony on, or ironic positioning on objects lasting 1,000 years in an empire. While, in fact, if software does one thing and does it very systematically, it promises infinitum, because you can really only update it. You do not delete it, you update it. You replace it with incremental steps, and what you do is you avoid the changes in the object from the view. So the viewer no longer actually has control over the changing object. My project in Olympia, which has a long title, was to use vegetation to my advantage. It was a sweet revenge on objects. And the objects being, in this case, the stadium in Berlin, made out of concrete, steel, and this stone of which I've just, the name escapes me, but a typical mid-central German reddish stone. And I had visited this place on several occasions, and I realized at one point that the building was made like an army. The stones, in fact, represent the bodies of soldiers, who individually mean not much, but when they're in the army body, they can become all-powerful. And from a corner, I had seen a part of the building that was neglected, and I saw how sunlight allowed a very precise growth of vegetation in that part. And I realized that German National Socialism was actually very much occupied with light. It was partly a religion of light, as most mid-modern ideologies were, especially when they started working with architecture. So I thought of making this piece where vegetation would grow in real time and would, after a number of years, which is still unclear, eclipse the image of the Olympic Stadium. So, but that's just one image. I will come back to that later. The date is December 10th, 2017. The situation has changed quite considerably. It's a piece that runs in real time with changing weather and with changing climatic conditions. So a lot of it is included into the programming. But then back to dark optics. In the era of dark optics, we lose mutual authentication. The origin of an image no longer includes an apparatus, a time, and a place. Suddenly the tableau and the relation to a painting sound familiar again. However, in 1839, it was read in the reverse order. So the middle sentence is, of course, deliberately confusing, because in 1830 it was the opposite way. You had the advent of photography, which actually made trashed the pictorial order of painting. Essentially put every painter onto the edge of abyss, and having to make radical choices. Now, we should maybe wonder why this new pictorial system came into existence, why it was. And I refuse to segregate aesthetic, technological, political, social aspects from one another. For me, they are one living organism that exists in concordance with one another. When we speak about a tableau, I do not actually refer literally to a digital painting. it's not some kind of Sunday afternoon aesthetic enjoyment, which is not linked to pictorial reality of the camera. In fact, what I mean by that is these images made out of concepts, made out of consensus, and made out of a certain reduction. So there we get back to the tableau. Don't despair if you're not following. We are filming everything, and maybe you can read it or go through it a second time later. Because I'm really meandering from one to the other, I realize that. It will get a little bit clearer with the minutes. And most importantly, this is actually the center of my keynote tonight, is the idea of confidence or trust in the camera. It forces us to admit that all along, photographic authenticity, the way we've known it through the history of photography, required confidence or trust in an apparatus. Not only celluloid, but just like one would find reassurance in the word of a member of one's own community, a mother or a brother. What am I saying when I actually take away these concepts of fake originality? Has this been filmed or has this been manipulated? What if I take all of these and I trash it for a moment and we just say, hang on. Basically, we start realizing that the history of photography was just, in fact, something we agreed upon collectively as a system of truth. And what is a system of truth is nothing else in theistic sense than a system of confidence. You inhabit someone else's thoughts. You are together in one kind of invisible way. When this system is disintegrating as we speak, we should ask what are the consequences? How should we relate to it? Maybe we shouldn't even ask the question, how should we relate to it? The truth is we relate to it. It's just maybe it's interesting to see that this confidence or trust was really what was going on behind the camera apparatus. And here, maybe I'll use the image of a young boy who turns instantly mad, or a young child who turns instantly mad when something traumatic happens in front of the eyes and is absolutely unable to cope with it. Madness is maybe a form of reflex on what you can't do, how to relate to déraison, and when this system of confidence or trust is gone, when you no longer have it in order to relate to it. Now, a few weeks ago, I had an interesting conversation for public with British artist Asita Dean in Bregenz, who's known for working exclusively with analog film, and who has this rather conservative approach to digital and analog, where she actually, at one point during the conversation, illustrated that the confidence in the analog image was a matter of religion. It was a matter of stepping into this trust system and relying on it. She gave the example quite interestingly that she said, in relation to my work, she said, when I film the sun with my 16 or 35 millimeter camera, I know that by the time I have the 5th or 6th generation celluloid or pellicule from that print, it is still a trace of the sun. It is still the sun, and with all its power, that has actually made this image. And I try to deconstruct it by referring to the system of confidence, because structurally, she was right really only conceptually. In the matter and in the medium, she was wrong. The celluloid had a certain speed. There was a particular lens used. she moved her body with her apparatus to a certain situation and then decided to record. There were just a number of steps which actually made really only the system of originality and fake versus non-fake really only a matter of thought or illusion, if you want. So the beauty of where we are now is that we know about the construct of it all. Of course, maybe I should precise a little bit the awareness of the consequences of the loss of confidence. With all I'm saying, I'm really not implying that the platforms for photography, documentary filmmaking, cinema, animation, street photography, documentary photography will all collapse. Quite on the contrary. We do not see that they have vanished. They appear to exist more flourishing than ever. This is important in the taking over of digital in any technology that it encounters. It simply eats everything it can, but it leaves the practices untouched. So the rituals of the practices, and that includes a documentary filmmaker, are untouched. The entire process of which I'm speaking is not something that occurs during a lifetime, okay? It is really only something hypothetically, shall we say, just over a very long term. A few words on the language of the image. The lens image can be credited for having established a lightning-fast language of images that could outrun linear writing and thus outrun writing of history altogether. I think I referred to that in the beginning of my speech. This actually comes from Willem Flusser, who wrote on photography, who actually exposed that image culture is a lightning-fast language with which linear writing cannot keep up, and became the dominant language in our culture. In fact, casting linear writing to the background. Now, when I refer to the 19th century, I'm actually referring to linear writing too. But don't try to understand that now. That comes later. Okay. The camera as a system of checks and balances is gone. This prompts a reorganization of the relation between word and image. I think I spoke about Cartesian space in 3D pictorial images. Although it doesn't actually show itself as a system of, or an order system, it shows itself actually as a system of freedom. In fact, it presents itself as another level of immersion. That brings with it the dreaded Cartesian dualism between mind and body, of which artists would really like to get rid of once and for all. And it made me think of the oppositions between the binary system of computing, linear perspective. It resembles, this is a phrase by Gilles Deleuze, le point de vue de deux and le point de vue de Dieu, where he refers to the geometry of Leibniz, Baroque philosopher and mathematician. And this is these beautiful moments where Deleuze captures a lot in a few phrases. Le point de vue de deux is, of course, a reference to the power of the binary system, which Leibniz introduced. Le point de vue de Dieu refers to Cartesian's perspective, to the all-powerful mono-eye that controls and observes everything and all objects. Now, from here on, I go to more images, which I think you might be wanting to see. And I will say a few words on, with illustrations, on the piece that I've just finished a few days ago and which is shown at Annette Geeling Gallery. They're always hilarious to look at because they always kind of expose the procedures. We work with 45 cameras for the confetti piece, and out of these 45 cameras come our scans made of people. And essentially the way I work is work in a hybrid system. I work between photography, the moving image, computing, and other, also painting, I suppose. This is an image of the final result, which has become a succession of 120 images in sequence. One could say it's a slideshow. It resembles older work that I have made, but it does so in a far more radical way, I believe. Now, and then I know this is confusing, it's also to me. I start talking about the new piece and then I jump back to theory. The horizon in the moving image is relating to what I said in the beginning, the anti-anthropocentric, where you do not accept as a filmmaker that humankind is the central subject of any image or any camera image, which in fact it is. There is no camera image without a human being being its core value or its core subject. And my search to try to give space to all these aspects of the moving image which belong to the trash, such as trees, witnesses, backgrounds, shadows, and which really only play a secondary role in image making, while the primary role is always the human being. We've spoken about reduction of diversity. It's funny, we could also say it's a reduction of biodiversity, maybe, and that echoes, of course, other aspects that are happening. And then, of course, the dichotomy between the hunter-gatherer eyes, which is, of course, the lens is actually crystallization of that, and then, of course, panoramic thought. Our struggle is and will always be that we actually have hunter-gatherer eyes, but that we are able to think in a panoramic manner. So I suppose that Cartesian dualism will be with us, unfortunately, for a while longer. So then that gives the foreground horizon problem. Now, much of what I do is also anti-essentialist in the sense that when you have what you have with conventional filmmaking or narrative filmmaking, you will always describe an essence, even when it's never revealed. You bring the viewer on a journey towards an essence. And the problem is, with the pieces that I make, is what happens when you actually give back only duration and only time, or when you give back only a horizon as a solution. It remains problematic, but it is, I think, essential to the things that I do. Something completely different on the first apparent is the pure necessity, which was recently made and shown first at the Rotterdam Film Festival. I usually never show at film festivals because I'm not sure if biologically a human being that sits collectively with a few hundred people in one room is my ideal situation for looking at the work. My ideal spectator is a spectator who's not actually locked to the seat, but who is unlocked and who has no guidance except for that which goes back to Walter Benjamin, the flaneur. In fact, the flaneur through a city, which picks up certain impressions and leaves others, which is in fact the cinematic viewer transposed to the museum. if you want. Now, The Pure Necessity is a remake of the Jungle Book 1967 animation. I wanted it to be exactly 1 hour, because clock time dictates that 1 hour is a good definition of boredom and of time passing. But my ambition was to take away all narrative, or as much as possible, certainly spoken narrative, all music, all dancing, and to make a hybrid between something that looks exactly like the Jungle Book animation, but where something else is introduced, something alien, and which is studies that I made of animals in zoos and animal parks. And of course, I spent months in situations like that, and the common denominator is, of course, boredom. And it taught me, working on this piece taught me a lot about what happened to cinema since, let's say, post-war period, cinema and television, and let's say through the Margaret Thatcher era, and of course now radical digitalization, that I realized that cinema had been, and that includes actually television, had been a system of putting people together, not just as a group, but as a family. And you watch the daily news all together as a family. And it probably came into being because of the things that happened during the Second World War, which prevented, in fact, dialogue after the Second World War. And maybe television was a way of just putting people next to one another and outsourcing the dialogue to a device. So it's a kind of, again, we're at the secular version of churchgoers. But I realized that in 1967, when the Jungle Book came out, that you could feel that the main pace of the animation was rhythm and dancing, and that there was this profound, almost emancipatory aspect into the film, where the strong, or let's say those who are in power and who could devour the other or dominate it, would actually take care of it. And in this case, of course, it would be a young boy called Mowgli. And that with post-Maggie Thatcher, you have this entire issue of collectivity erased and replaced by individual perception onto a small device. So that's, I guess that's the metaphor present in the Jungle Book piece. So my preference for duration as a almost painterly tool, one could say, or sculptural tool, came together with biological time, with breathing in and out, sleeping, wasting time, all these essences for me, which are, let's say, in a capitalist society, which are considered to be wastes. And so there's a certain attraction to all those waste products. And the problem of speed, the paradox that's inherent in any moving image. What is the problem of speed? It is this inherent violence in this 25 frames per second, which you are absolutely incapable of following, but nevertheless present themselves to you as a state of something natural, something which you could live. It's difficult to remain focused on slow processes that run in sync with real time. A few examples then would be Olympia, The Pure Necessity, and the Bordeaux piece. Now a little bit more about Olympia. So I'm jumping back a little bit to this work. Here you have the entire title. And Olympia is really all about the confrontation between ideological time, or the imagined time and biological time. And biological time is aging processes, all these aspects of duration that are annoying, but which belong to actually being somewhere. This is the image that gave the idea, or that prompted the idea for the whole piece, on which I worked about 3.5 years. By the way, I love working for a long time and spending a lot of labor, because I think labor is undervalued and should not permeate on the surface, but should permeate really only as a kind of sweet revenge over time. You have, this is the irony, and at the same time also poetic Nazi beauty, where you have sunlight, in fact, dictating how fast vegetation grows. So you have the vegetation that's on the right of the image, which really only receives a fraction of the light that the vegetation receives on the left side of the image. And it makes a perfect descendance into shadows. So I'm not sure if someone else discovered that in the Olympic Stadium, but this is practically moving to tears beauty on the relation between light and the architecture. It's kind of a religion of light and a very immersive situation. This is what prompted the idea. Now, of course, what I wanted really with the Olympic Stadium piece was to change the narrative of the Third Reich, or to change political narrative into a biological one, where I have a lot of fun imagining how in the future the people who will take care of the work, it's a piece of software, so it needs to be updated, will actually find themselves speaking much more about weeds and vegetation and trees, while actually the subject matter and the title are still all about the Third Reich. So on all levels, vegetation eclipses slowly but certainly architecture and ideology. It's an early sketch of the work. And then I started, of course, doing small researches for a few years on the Olympic Stadium. This is Pripyat next to Chernobyl, where we have, I believe, almost exactly 25 years of uninterrupted growth, and where you can see how vegetation pushes. Talking about the reduction in biodiversity, of course, the challenge with Olympia was to speak about, to have conversations with many people, including biologists, material expert, an architect, on what plants would normally grow, what would be the true actors of my work. And there's surprisingly few. I believe it's like core of 15 to 20 species that we're talking about. And then I started doing simulations. I was once upon a time trained as a lithographer and a painter. And so I still make a lot of studies on how to imagine the piece. So these are, I mean, the Germans would absolutely hate that because it's so much weeds. While if they have been good at anything after post-World War II is making sure that it would look like life just goes on. And this is the way the Olympia piece is installed at the time in 2017 in Berlin. This is Schaulager in Basel in 2017, an entirely emptied out exhibition space, no walls. And then a few snapshots of the work. So this is really the only memory that we keep of the installation, is a little program running inside the program, like a kind of how do you say it, memory of the work. This is April 3rd, 2016. So that's really at the beginning. We started on March the 15th, 2016, where virtually for the last time the grass was cut. It's already September of the same year. In the background you can see this one building, which is a Unité Habitation by Le Corbusier, which is placed over several places in Europe. One is there, which will of course disintegrate, but you will not notice it. Here you have again this magnificent light, which really is always different every day of the season. An image grabbed during wintertime. It was hilarious when the first snow came. There had never been as many visitors in the exhibition space as when the snow came. I suppose. No, I don't know why. Because the building is just 7 kilometers away from the exhibition space. Rain in March. Oh, that is night. You can see a little bit of moonlight. And the beauty with computing is that if you do something precise, it really does it much better than, let's say, modernist militaristic order. August 4th, 2017. Of course, I'm not going to illustrate how the work really functions, but it's a permanent animation or a permanent circle around the stadium, which goes one turn every hour. So it's 24 turns per hour. It's a good piece to live with because it really mediates between film time and breathing time. Okay, so far for my, I would say introduction, but you're going to kill me if I call it that way. I'll go to the work which is in Amsterdam at the moment, and I'll probably end with something that some of you might know. I've made only one public work in my career, and it's situated down Central Station above the metro line, north-south metro line, and it is a weather announcement system for the next day, on a big LED wall. So it's rather sophisticated work. If I have the time, I would really love to speak about that piece as well. The confetti piece was produced over a period of 3 years. And as often, I'm a bookworm. I don't read that much, but I look a lot in books. And I have a collection, and these prompt ideas. I think I have this picture since about 15 years. And it's actually 2 pictures together that gave me the idea of panic on one hand and euphoria on the other hand. And I felt that those 2 ideas of panic and euphoria both had a certain weight to them. And remember, we spoke about digital materiality. In digital materiality, everything happens in between states. There's no realized state. But it doesn't mean that it's not real. It doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect. So I started thinking about what was the guiding principle behind the idea of the confetti piece would be weight and weightlessness. And somehow the matter of, or the particles in confetti were really something that simply the way I work is I do not know what gives me an idea. All I can do is try to find out by making the work. But somehow I felt the confetti like snow. But if you have it in photography, it somehow never stops falling, just like the snowflakes would do. And in that sense, I think the snowflakes or confetti particles have become part of my family of categories of sunlight, shades, the passage of time, etc. In the sense that they do somehow visualize a matter, a particular matter very clearly. A matter that is in between states. These are again some of my sketches. I draw throughout the process of working, and these sketches are far more recently when we already had ideas on how to make the composition. When we speak about dark optics, we are also speaking about what it is to be blind and what it is to have only memory to rely upon. But of course, memory is not only a memory carries much more with it. And the future of any image is always memory. But the memory is not, it's not something untouchable. It's something that you can touch quite truly. It brings with it ideas of touch, sensations, intensity, breathing fast or slow. And it's all these things that you'd never pay attention to. And of course, the moving image is simply a system of annihilating temporarily all those processes that go on in your body, which you just take for granted. Some research pictures for the confetti piece. I tried to resist the American election theme, but it was impossible. Not because of the election theme that which Trump manages to monopolize every day on television, but simply because of the, I would say, this is my way of pulling out, is I would say because of the three colors, the red, the white and the blue. From the tests that we had done with lighting up these confetti pieces virtually, came about a certain historicizing quality in the light, a certain almost quasi-baroque aspect to it, which simply was not there when I would use minimalistic silver confetti. And I deliberated a long time on the use of the politically explicit American theme, but then decided to take out the most prominent images, let's say the banners hanging all over the place, or the names of the candidate. Then there's a bit of technique in coming up now, okay? So sorry for that. But I really, I don't make a distinction between technique and philosophy at all. We've seen those. Did I say something about digital matter? It drips off the character that we are seeing. This is in fact what we call a clay model of a scanned figure. And a clay model is nothing but a blurb of synthetic material coming out of a process of computing done by 45 still cameras. This is just a way that I like working with by being blind but still having a camera memory. We photographed approximately 100 figurants in the studio, all separately. This looks very science fiction, I know, but that's my studio with the rig, with 45 cameras set up, ready for the scan. I think someone defined the confetti piece recently as the rigged election piece, which is really true on two levels. The little boy, which is at the core of the image. So what the confetti piece tries to do is, I have obstacles. So I give myself obstacles. The Tricolore American team, election team, is an obstacle. It's something over which one would remember the Olympia piece. One would endlessly have discussions and debates on the political topic, but they would be eclipsed over time by something else, and that is this materiality, which is digital. We had then on top of that, in the center of the work, that little figure, and it's the second time I work with a young actor, or figurant, if you may. I did so in the Quiet Short too, where you have a little boy who happens to be a black boy with both parents who are the center of the work. They're the nucleus. They're essentially the eye of the storm. And surrounded by white Anglo-Saxon culture, if you want. We did screaming sessions with that boy, and the scream itself was again one of these obstacles. So we've had the confetti, we've had the election team, and we've had the black and white. Those are all oppositions. They're only trouble. They only mean trouble in terms of narrative way. But I kind of like to climb these walls and to get over them. The scream is another one of these obstacles. How can you have a scream that's utterly mute? And I think, I'm not sure, but I think I wanted to have the scream in because it is also digital matter. It shows that that audio and image have actually nothing to do with one another, and that audio is best heard without any sound. And I try to generate this mute scream where you would have a volume, a certain volume, but not have any evidence of it. And then some process images of how we made a sculpture out of the little fellow. And then, of course, the backdrop needed to be made. It is loosely based on a castle, Bad Bentheim, in northwestern Germany. My assistants tend to take their time for every object that they want to make. It generates sometimes really hilarious screenshots. And then this is probably a brick wall under construction made by an algorithm. It's funny how digitality makes trash from many aspects of modern art, isn't it? There's so many things that come back with a vengeance. That's the building in question. And that's the confetti. The way the confetti was made was of course at the center of the work. It was also, of course, a problem. It was one of these obstacles. And I relied on my team to, we discussed endlessly. Yeah? This is the future of any image is discussion, is debate. And debate means that you agree on something and you leave out certain things and include others. So how to do the confetti was a similar journey, because digital confetti doesn't have a body. So we decided to choose a body, and the body would be falling dust, a cloud of dust which someone throws out. Then the dust the particles of the dust were replaced by confetti pieces. And then my aim was to lit up the confetti pieces as if they were flower petals, as if they had a lightness which was unlike confetti leaves. So in order to transcend a sort of nationalist American theme. But this is how the confetti looks in empty air. They are actually then sliced up in many layers so that they could be, how do you say, inserted into the people that are in the scene. That's really the brain of the computer doing this. This is when it's replaced by confettis. Did I say something about Cartesian space and how photography really seems to be married in virtual reality with Cartesian space, with the system of coordinates? This is all the people together. They had no idea they would be together at one point. But of course, you know, when you are blind, it is difficult to stage. It's difficult to stage a moment of euphoria or even a moment of anxiety. No, maybe I should say a moment of anxiety. No, we're culturally very good at that. But a moment of euphoria is a little bit harder. Angst is always easy. These are some snapshots of my studio wall a few weeks ago, as the final decisions were made on the images. Debate, debate, debate. So, of course, you can say, excuse me, but why don't you just take a camera and make a situation and just simply do it? And the aspect of when you work like a mole under the ground without any idea of what's happening above you, when you work in the system of utter madness where you have to rely entirely on memory, it forces you to expose your own limitations on what you think are the objects around you. And the reason why we work a long time is that I would like to give to myself and my team the time to understand these limitations and to transcend them. And one could say the reason why I work so deeply, so radically within digital matter is because I want to oppose it. It's not so much because I'm in love with it, but it is because I'm essentially using the weapons of my enemy. And then these are some of the final images of the work. But we'll go through that quickly. It doesn't make sense to have a real-time work or a work that takes 16.5 minutes shown here. Sometimes I've wondered why, when we think about the exhibition that's on view right now, why I do not actually work much more on digital matter and instead prefer to work on digital materiality. Materiality being that state which resembles the photographic image, but which is radically not. And I think it's probably because I am profoundly figurative, and I really love working with the residue of the camera, and therefore also probably because I really don't have a lot of expertise on the binary system and on how to deconstruct or expose data streams and so forth and so on. But if you just think for a moment about the works you've seen here above or next to us, is you do see somehow when a digital structure is exposed, you nevertheless have a very traditional or conventional working together of sound and image, where sound has depth and a bass effect to it, and therefore also a spatial effect. And in fact, you know, I don't think you can expose digital matter altogether. It does one thing very well, and this is always to escape to escape you grasping it. You can't. It's a code which is only accessible temporarily by specialists. The weather engine. It's 2018 and the end date is undefined, I hope as long as possible. This is the space where the weather engine is installed. You can see this strip with text there. That's where the screen comes, which is there now. These are early visits to the space when there was not yet a running metro line. And somehow in the structure of that the architect had foreseen in this metro station, I was echoed. Echoes came of, among others, Mondrian's semi-abstract work. And of course the Dutch landscape, which is unavoidable if you're Flemish. We don't have any of it, you have a lot of it. But it's always the same, there's always a canal and a view in the distance and never a hill, or very rarely. So it brought me to this, and then this, which was a visit to the north landscape of Amsterdam, and then this accidental image, which resembles so many, of a canal, a path next to it, and then a dike. I found the dike very handy as a image aspect because it conceals the horizon. So on the horizon really only, this is work in progress, it's not the work finished. The horizon really only was shown to the left. And the idea would be there with the weather engine that people use the subway several times per week, maybe twice a day at least or more. And they would do so often also in wintertime, or maybe more often in wintertime than in summertime. And basically, you know, metro, underground, you're again like a mole, not seeing what's going on above it. And I thought, why not announce the weather for tomorrow and be useful for a change? And but through the landscape. So what we did is we merge system announcement data with the landscape. So it's always you see always live not, but you see an anticipation of 24 hours ahead of you. And whether it's snow, ice, flooding, spring, summer, autumn, it's all there. The falling leaves. And I have not really prepared this keynote very much. It's a bit of a random collection of images. And here we have fireworks during the day in summertime, which is of course an impossibility. This is a heavily frozen screen with ice. This is, I think it must be a late summer night when the character, I didn't tell you that. There's a character. There's a guy, you could say he's jobless, but it's just the stage above jobless would have an employment for the city of Amsterdam to clean the leaves. And he's doing that, so he's always active, and I thought it was, if I have a computer model as a worker, a city worker, why not have him work all the time? So he's all the time occupied with something. But recently I've heard from echoes of people that actually they don't see him very often. So we need to look into that. And here he's he's collecting, you can see him in the foreground. But he does many things. In summertime he swims, he takes holidays. He has a function also to write messages on the screen, but which are in reverse, so you can't read them. You have to sort of read them backwards. He does a lot of useless work, essentially. This is rain. Rain with a bit of programming text in it. Sorry for that. So we do use the screen quite actively when we can. He's even wiping off the screen. This is snow. Don't know what the boat is doing there, but I think that's not. This is a very picturesque sunset, I mean. This must be sunrise. Again, sunrise is really only reserved for early birds, right? If you come at noon, light is pretty much dull. And the sort of secondary effect of having a LED wall as a screen is that a LED wall has very powerful light output. And when you have this light early in the morning, I can assure you it hurts. And I always found this fascinating with projections, is that they're really simulations of light, and they really imitate sunlight, but they do so powerfully. They don't, projections are never modest. They want to assimilate as close as possible to what they're representing. I think here he's starting to prepare for flooding. Fog. Oh, I think this is quite advanced version of the defense wall. And then some very early, these are really early simulations. We have the two windmills, which kind of subjectively illustrate wind, even the direction of the wind, mind you. So we're looking towards the north, because what we're really talking about is about subway connection between the south and the north of the city. The view is to the north. So you can determine, you can see which direction the wind will come the next day. Yeah, that's proper flooding without any protection. That's stormy weather. This is how we work. So we start with all these sketchy situations and then try to get them deeper and deeper and try to reintroduce more plasticity in them. This is from years ago, in fact. Oh yeah, there was a lot of opposition to the typically Dutch windmill, which I can understand, which became then the industrial windmill. And then that's the character, which happens to be me. These are just some, illustrations of how this is done. I love that one. He's a bit of a loser, right? Sorry for the peaking data. That's, previous is my skeleton carrying one of the sandbags that you can see in the image. These are different expressions. That's summer. Texturing. And then getting a skeleton. And this is seen from top. This is my character also has a tendency of painting the landscape, but he does so quite rigorously, including the grass, the road, and the trees. And he can paint them in any color. So that's, I think, more or less what I wanted to say to you today. And thank you. And I don't know, maybe there are questions I'll be glad to answer.